Okay, my title is What Shakespeare Teaches Us About Psychological Complexity. As you're probably aware, what's published isn't always what the author originally wrote, especially if you're a Shakespeare authorship doubter who is trying to get published in a mainstream book or journal. The final version of my chapter went through numerous drafts over several months. I am grateful that the two editors took the risk of inviting this outsider to contribute a chapter to their book. Perhaps because of feedback from Routledge, the publisher, they asked me to revise my first draft by moving everything about the person I joined Freud in considering to be the real Shakespeare, the 17th Earl of Oxford, to an endnote. Months later, they asked for another revision, including the deletion of that endnote. I felt many other changes they requested did strengthen my essay. For example, they really wanted to know more about DID. But I thought I'd take this opportunity to share with you some of the material that will not appear in the book. I'll let you know when I'll move on to what will be published because it was a long endnote. The surprisingly bitter controversy over who wrote the works of Shakespeare illustrates the tension between simplicity and complexity. I knew Freud supported the 1920 theory that the Earl of Oxford, 1550 to 1604, wrote these works, but his opinion struck me as eccentric until the New York Times in 2002 reported new evidence that provides strong support for Freud's views. Oxford's Geneva Bible from 1570 at the Folger Shakespeare Library shows a strongly Shakespearean interest in selected biblical passages, which are more and more likely to be annotated in Oxford's Bible the more times they are echoed in Shakespeare's works. Freud believed that connecting the literary works with Oxford's life would deepen our psychoanalytic understanding of those works. This Oxfordian theory, backed in my opinion by far more evidence than is the traditional theory, remains surprisingly unfamiliar to Shakespeare scholars who dismiss it without having studied it objectively. Even psychoanalysts seemingly anxious not to be perceived as eccentric have eschewed Freud's views on who wrote Shakespeare. It was Freud's English translator and former patient, James Strachey, who persuaded Freud to downplay his opinion. The prominent analyst Ernst Kriss observed that biographies of artists often reflect the wish of the biographer to create an appealing legend of a social ascent from humble beginnings, like Shakespeare of Stratford. Oxford is dismissed with the false claim that he died before some of Shakespeare's plays were written. But this is never said of the traditional author, despite his dying 7 years before half the plays were published. And Ramon Jimenez's convincing conclusion that Oxford wrote the anonymous earlier versions of some Shakespeare plays, like most Oxfordian research, is ignored by mainstream scholars. One of the most important intellectual skills that universities try to impart to their students is critical thinking. It's now more important than ever as ideological extremists and social media spread falsehoods. Departments of English are on the front lines in teaching the skills of critical thinking. So it is especially ironic, even dangerous, that examination of who wrote Shakespeare should be made implicitly exempt from a critical, impartial evaluation of the evidence. When prominent scholars such as Columbia University's James Shapiro joke about failing any student who dares raise the authorship question, we are seeing deductive thinking replacing the inductive reasoning discovered in the Renaissance that is essential to critical thinking. We are also seeing the destructive roles of tradition, authority, circular thinking, cherry-picking selected evidence, and ad hominem rather than ad rem engagement with those whose evaluation of the evidence leads them to challenge the now prevailing authorship theory, all typical manifestations of groupthink. Sadly, an objective observer is forced to conclude that Stratfordians like Shapiro are following an unconsciously faith-based rather than truly evidence-based methodology, perhaps because they know that evidence for the traditional authorship theory is far less than 100% conclusive. My dilemma here is that the space of the chapter does not allow me to do justice to the thousands of books and articles that have presented evidence for the Oxfordian authorship theory. J. Thomas Looney's 1920 Shakespeare Revealed was the first and remains one of the best summaries of the relevant literary and biographical evidence. Freud read Looney's book twice not long after it appeared and became convinced Oxford wrote all of the Shakespeare plays. In contrast with the deductive reasoning, which begins with the unquestioned premise that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, Looney, reasoning inductively, first assembled a long list of characteristics of the author from his close reading of the works, then read about known Elizabethan poets in the Dictionary of National Biography. And he found a perfect match in Oxford. That is, someone who was praised as a leading poet and playwright, but who was known to prefer to write anonymously. Now, music is played, or technical musical terminology is used correctly in every Shakespeare play. The version of the Psalms that most inspired Shakespeare's sonnets was a translation in regular meter set to music for congregational hymn singing in the Sternhold and Hopkins Whole Book of Psalms. And much of Oxford's early signed poetry are song lyrics. Like all courtiers, one of Oxford's primary goals was to please Queen Elizabeth. Unlike most other courtiers, though, he suffered from what a contemporary called a fickle head. After all, for reasons unknown, he stabbed a servant to death when he was 17. He treated his first wife, Anne, abominably, exacerbated by the pathological jealousy that led him to falsely accuse her of having their first child by another man. He was a constant thorn in the side of his father-in-law, Lord Burleigh, his erstwhile guardian after Oxford's father died when he was 12. He was nevertheless described as one of the Queen's favorites, and she gave him a mysterious annuity of £1,000, which King James continued for Oxford's last year of life. The plays, I believe, grow substantially in complexity when we shift our authorship hypothesis to Oxford. The Stratfordian scholar Susan James proposed that Kate's about-face in the last act of The Taming of the Shrew alludes to a dramatic near-death experience of Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's favorite stepmother. That Shakespeare would have known this story and reminded the Queen and her courtiers of it in this play is far more credible if Shakespeare was a courtier himself. In the first quarto of Hamlet, Cloambus is the character who will be renamed Polonius in the later quartos. Lord Burleigh's motto was cor unum vita una, one heart, one way. By mocking contrast, Cloambus implies double-hearted or duplicitous, since the Latin ambos means both or the two, Since the 19th century, some Shakespeareans identified Cloambus in the first quarter of Hamlet and Polonius in later versions of the play as a caricature of Lord Burleigh. It has long been noted that Polonius' advice to Laertes echoes Burleigh's advice to his son, published in 1611, years after Hamlet was written. Since Looney proposed in 1920 that Oxford wrote Shakespeare, however, many Shakespeare scholars have backtracked, denying that Shakespeare would have dared spoof Burleigh as Polonius. Shakespeare of Stratford, the merchant, sure would not have. Oxfordians, that is, those of us who believe the Earl of Oxford wrote Shakespeare's works, have little difficulty believing this, given Oxford's stormy relationship with his father-in-law. Once again, excessive loyalty to the traditional authorship theory deprives us of appreciating Shakespeare's full complexity, including his provocative satire on powerful court figures. And what about the complexity of the unconscious factors that influence assumptions that Shakespeare scholars make? When we deeply admire someone, we identify with them, highlighting our similarities. For most of us, that is far easier to do if Shakespeare, like us, was not an aristocrat, much less the highest-ranked earl in Elizabethan England. Further, groupthink can exert powerful unconscious influences on us as we wish to remain in the mainstream among our teachers, colleagues, and friends, rather than be shunned as a crank. It is characteristic of groupthink to dismiss opponents with bitter ad hominem insults and mockery, rather than take an ad rem approach to new evidence that undermines a prevailing paradigm. Further, we may still prefer to idealize the Elizabethan age as a time when playwrights were free to express themselves openly, rather than face up to the strongly authoritarian aspects of Queen Elizabeth's rule that Graham Holderness credited Delia Bacon with being the first to identify. Okay, I'll now move on to what was not censored and hopefully will get published in July. Harold Bloom asserted that, quote, Shakespeare is the original psychologist and Freud the belated rhetorician. Bloom noted that Freud found in Shakespeare's works the seeds of Freud's crucial discoveries about the unconscious mind. In turn, psychoanalysis has helped illuminate the astonishing complexity of Shakespeare, arguably the greatest creative writer in history. Freud repeatedly turned to literature to illustrate his theories about the salience of unconscious conflicts in driving our behavior and emotions, most famously Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannos. We still have much to learn from Shakespeare about the mind. My chapter will focus on Shakespeare's astonishing grasp of psychological complexity. For example, Shakespeare repeatedly removed from his literary sources any plot material that would provide a straightforward motivation for his characters, allowing greater psychological complexity that challenge us to think more deeply about the causes of their actions. One of the many enigmas about Shakespeare is just how he offers such universal appeal across the centuries, across the globe, across social classes, and across all age groups. Exploring various dimensions of his complexity will help us better understand this universality. He was extraordinarily successful in surmounting our usual tendency to regress to oversimplified false binaries. Psychoanalysis is the study of the mind in conflict, and Shakespeare is unsurpassed in his evocation of mental conflict as a way of understanding people in greater depth. Some scholars consider it improper to view Shakespeare's characters as comparable to real people with an inner world and a relevant backstory. This is ironic since Shakespeare's characters come close to literary perfection in their verisimilitude. Shakespeare wrote, "Let us on your imaginary forces work." So we rely on our imaginations to experience Shakespeare as he intended. Shakespeare scholars may have a shared unconscious wish that the author himself would be more fictive than real. If so, denying that his characters are real would be a displacement from this unconscious fantasy. Albert Einstein advised, make things as simple as possible, but no simpler. We are always in danger of making Shakespeare too simple. Yet Shakespeare's popularity challenges any assumption that we crave only simple narratives. We must also be drawn to complexity, or we would not love Shakespeare's works as much as we do. Perhaps it is our conscious mind that prefers to keep things simple, while our unconscious mind resonates more with Shakespeare's complexity. Carolyn Brown calls the 1980s the heyday of psychoanalytic criticism of Shakespeare. What happens when Shakespearean literary theorists borrow from psychoanalysis? Being theorists themselves, it is naturally psychoanalytic theory that especially attracts their attention. However, unlike psychoanalytic clinicians who use theory primarily to enhance their clinical skills, literary scholars are prone to assign priority to psychoanalytic theory over data from clinical analysis. This places them at risk of reifying theory and contributes to theoretical conflicts. In clinical work, integrative concepts such as overdetermination and multiple function help us borrow from numerous seemingly conflicting theories in their application to a given clinical problem. As a clinical psychoanalyst for the past 47 years, I would emphasize that psychoanalytic practice involves a much more complex application of theory blended with close study of the uniqueness of each patient. Similarly, psychoanalytic approaches to Shakespeare need to balance theory with close reading of Shakespeare's text. Ideally, theory can illuminate and help explain obscure data. Maladaptively, it can contribute to groupthink, confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and blind spots. Reductionism is a risk with all theory-driven approaches to Shakespeare. Psychoanalysts try to lessen analogous risks in our clinical work by allowing the patient's material to shape the analyst's interpretations, rather than imposing one or another a priori theory on the clinical data. In the case of Shakespeare, we must be faithful to the text. We should turn to Shakespeare's psychological genius to discover new insights into the mind that may have been overlooked by psychoanalytic theory. For example, Dinko Poltorok has written cogently about Shakespeare's insights into the interactions among his characters, an important topic that is overlooked when the focus is restricted to individual characters. Shakespeare has anticipated insights that later came from the psychoanalytic study of couples, families, and groups, large and small. Historians of science have singled out as one of Freud's most significant contributions his theory of the so-called complemental series, which guards against oversimplification by observing that causative factors are often multifactorial in various combinations and weightings. The etiological interaction of genetic vulnerability and traumatic experiences is one example in clinical psychoanalysis. In his book on dreams, Freud emphasized that a single element in the conscious manifest content of a dream usually has many unconscious meanings. In exegesis of Shakespeare's works, these concepts remind us that we should not downplay alternative interpretations of the text as we highlight our own. When a group of scholars are followers of any given interpretive theory, the risk of oversimplification is magnified. Stephen Booth's classic 1977 book, Shakespeare's Sonnets, is astonishing in highlighting the polysemous meanings of each line of poetry. The more closely Shakespeare's text is read, especially in the sonnets, the more hidden layers of meaning are unlocked. Clinical psychoanalysts can learn a great deal about their own similar tool of close listening from the close reading of Shakespeare's words. Psychoanalysis and Shakespeare studies can be mutually enriching. Booth glosses several words in every sonnet as having 3 or more contrasting meanings that may all be relevant. Booth provides one of Shakespeare scholarship's best models for identifying and tolerating the complexity of Shakespeare's poetry. He said, quote, "The great virtue of poetic embodiments of human experience is that they house undeniable contradictions of response." Unconscious communication is a powerful source of Shakespeare's unique appeal and constitutes one reason he is said to know us better than we know ourselves. His words have one set of meanings on a literal conscious level, but also deeper levels of meaning that may influence us more strongly precisely because, as a form of subliminal stimuli, they bypass our conscious evaluation and censorship. "Et tu, Brute," is among Shakespeare's most famous lines. "Even you, Brutus," echoes the similar words the ancient biographer Suetonius attributed to the dying Julius Caesar, "Kai su teknon," or "even you, my son," in Greek. I would suggest that Shakespeare is also appealing to a biblically literate audience's recollection that 2 of the Koine Greek Gospels have Jesus code switch to his native Aramaic with his dying words, namely, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." He was quoting from Psalm 22. Implicitly, Shakespeare is inviting us to feel more sympathy for the dying Caesar, as his words, as well as his switch from English to Latin, make us think of the martyred code-switching Jesus on the cross, also voicing his sense of betrayal by someone, his heavenly Father, whom he previously trusted. Next topic, the perils of groupthink. In my observation, excessive adherence to theory and related vulnerability to the groupthink that accompanies it is as much of a pitfall for psychoanalysts as it is for literary scholars. However, as Leo Rangel observed, the growing number of competing analytic theories has much to do with the narcissism of the originators and promoters of new theories, and less to do with clinical utility. Like Joseph Sandler, he recommended instead that analysts borrow from all theories that are clinically useful and drop those that are not. Robert Welder classified psychoanalytic observations from the most experienced near to the most abstract and philosophical. He noted that the latter are of less value in clinical work. Similarly, the question to ask of any literary theory is how much it enhances our appreciation of literature. Theory can deepen our understanding of certain areas while posing the risk of excessively downplaying rather than integrating alternative perspectives. Each of our cerebral neurons sends out collateral fibers to suppress adjacent neurons, enhancing the signal-to-noise ratio of the messages they are trying to communicate. Just because our neurons behave that way, however, does not mean that we should. A major feature of groupthink is reacting with ad hominem rejection of those who do not conform to the core but unproven beliefs of the group, rather than examining new evidence with objectivity. Groupthink does promote group cohesiveness, but at the expense of the freedom to challenge received wisdom that is essential to critical thinking and intellectual progress. Another break. Anybody want to fill me in on anything I've missed while I've been talking? I keep getting emails. I think I'll take a break before, as Sam's talking, to respond to those emails. I just don't feel, I feel bad making all of you wait that long. A psychoanalytic approach to Shakespeare can usefully borrow from a range of relevant experiences of clinical psychoanalysis. Much of our training focuses on trying to be more objective about our patients by constantly attending to the distorting effects of our own psychology. We are always listening to our patients' associations for potential indirect commentary on how they view our interventions. We learn about our blind spots, our projections of some conflict of our own onto our patient, our premature or inaccurate interpretations, and what may trigger traumatic transferences in patients with histories of childhood neglect or abuse. Some of the most trenchant commentary has to be decoded from the patient's unconscious communications, often through displacement. For example, when a patient speaks of someone else who does or does not understand them. By contrast, though, when we turn to literary scholarship, we have the text, but it does not talk back to us. Naturally, we can test out our literary interpretations by close reading. The more we know about the author, the more context we have for our interpretations. Now, I am not endorsing reductionistic readings that overemphasize biography, of course, but it is misleading to believe the text should be amputated from its author. In my opinion, this is a major problem that may unconsciously stem from the traditional but unproven attribution of Shakespeare's works to Shakespeare of Stratford, whose documented life experiences offer scarcely more than a son named Hamlet to connect with the works. Psychoanalytic approaches to Shakespeare's works would be enormously enriched by an open-minded search for his identity. Carolyn Brown calls psychoanalysis, quote, one of the largest bodies of criticism of Shakespeare, and one that has produced some of the most probing analyses of Shakespeare's texts. She recognizes the risk of reductionism in any theory-driven approach to understanding Shakespeare, but she aims to restore the tarnished reputation of psychoanalytic perspectives on Shakespeare. Brown writes that, quote, Shakespearean psychoanalytic criticism burgeoned in the 1980s, but it experienced a setback in 1986 when Stephen Greenblatt published an essay that posits that the Renaissance view of identity differs from that of psychoanalytic theory. However, Greenblatt begins his chapter with the clarification, quote, I do not propose that we abandon the attempts at psychologically deep readings of Renaissance texts. Since Greenblatt seems to have been misunderstood, or possibly to have changed his mind since then, I will quote what he wrote to me about this matter. Only 1 hour after I sent Greenblatt my review of Brown's book, this is in 2017, he replied, thank you for the very interesting review, Rick. I'm a bit perplexed, I confess, that my essay was seen as an attack on psychoanalytic criticism. I haven't read the essay for years, but I remember my argument as being that the key concepts deployed in psychoanalytic interpretations of Shakespeare were in effect invented in the Renaissance and incorporated already in Shakespeare. My point, insofar as I recall, was simply to observe that psychoanalysis should not be thought of as a privileged visitor, in effect from another world, with a perspective radically different from that already in place. That point may be wrong, of course, but it is not, or at least not necessarily, to be viewed as an attack. I think one reason that my chapter was accepted was that I had that email to quote from, and I was asked to get Stephen's permission to publish it, and he gave me permission. Next, the topic is multiplicity of identity in psychopathology in Normality and in Hamlet. Philip Bromberg helped popularize the concept that each person's identity consists of a range of distinct self-states, formerly called ego states. A common example involves our dreams. Dreams include aspects of our waking self-states, but they also involve nocturnal self-states that have much greater access to childhood self-states and their memories, as well as to other aspects of our unconscious mind. For example, people with anger management issues seem to switch to a distinct self-state when enraged, like the Hulk comic book character. Alcohol and other substances, by lessening inhibitions, may lead to a switch to distinct intoxicated self-states, including sexualized ones. Foreign language proficiency involves creating a new self-state for that language. Beginning to dream in this new language is a favorable sign about the learning process. The multilingual will confirm that they do not always notice the multiple meanings of words in the various languages they know, since those languages are often compartmentalized into distinct linguistic self-states. Yet another reflection of Shakespeare's creative genius was that, as Booth points out, Shakespeare always seemed aware of every possible meaning and connotation of each word he used in the various languages he knew. Psychoanalysts once maintained that creative people have greater than usual access to their unconscious. We might now reframe this and say they have more permeable boundaries among their various self-states, which in a writer can then act cooperatively to co-create the work of literature. I believe this was unusually true of Shakespeare. Optimal mental health, and especially artistic creativity, seem to be promoted by greater mutual awareness and cooperation among our self-states. Think of the comparison and possibly the literal example of the brilliant synergistic interplay of a 5-part Bach organ fugue, which Bach was said to be able to improvise. Similarly, Shakespeare is a genius at what we might call verbal fugues. In his plays, his extraordinary empathy for all his characters may have reflected his profound awareness of his own diverse self-states, masculine and feminine, and of interactions among them. Self-acceptance promotes empathy for and tolerance of others. Bromberg wrote that literature at its best can activate in one moment 2 or more self-states that are usually kept distant from each other, such as sadness and humor. He said we often tear up when strong but conflicting emotions are simultaneously activated. Intriguingly, Bromberg recounts what he called a traumatic experience when he was a graduate student in English. Bromberg had offended a professor by writing an essay on Prince Hal's personality. Quote, "I was deliberately shamed in front of the class by a professor who announced that I didn't belong in the field." Referring to Bromberg's efforts to understand Prince Hal's psychology, the professor said, "We don't do that sort of thing here." What a case study in groupthink, shaming someone who fails to submit to prevailing but flawed literary theories that focus with tunnel vision on the text alone. Bromberg dutifully dropped out of graduate school, but later earned a PhD in psychology. Now, poetry was always sung in ancient times, and it needs to be sung still to help link our verbal and pre-verbal self-states. Shakespeare's deep interest in music, as well as in the musical potential of language, can further broaden our appreciation for his psychological complexity. One scholar in 1974 demonstrated that Shakespeare amplified the complexity of his plays by including technical musical terms in his sophisticated use of Renaissance rhetoric. He found Shakespeare to be unique among Elizabethan playwrights in so doing. Shakespeare often uses words such as burden that play on both their ordinary meaning as well as on their technical meaning in music, where burden can be the refrain or the bass line. Shakespeare's pronounced musicality helps connect his audience with their younger, more emotionally centered self-states that are at the deepest core of our identity, going back to the formative pre-linguistic phases of childhood. Before infants learn language, they understand music perfectly. It was recently reported that they move to music as soon as they can control their muscles. In our early life, we grasped meaning through the emotional tones and rhythms of speech before we understood its semantic content. The part of our brain that supports implicit or procedural memory develops much earlier than the part that supports explicit and verbal memory. The former has more to do with emotions and music, and the latter more to do with our use of language, including verbal memory. Shakespeare's extraordinary use of visual imagery also activates our implicit memory, which then helps shape our complex responses to his words. In my clinical practice, I specialize in working intensively with patients who suffer from dissociative identity disorder, DID. Alters are more dissociated forms of self-states. This long-standing clinical experience has accustomed me to close listening, attuned to my patients' various alters. As I will soon explain, this work influences my close reading of Shakespeare, which I will illustrate with the character Hamlet. Because patients with DID experience severe psychological trauma before their unitary sense of identity was fully formed, their inner conflicts typically take the form of conflicts among their various alters. This personification may parallel a playwright who creates characters that reflect various aspects of his or her own complex and conflicted mind. One of the many misconceptions about DID is the fallacious assumption that such people are severely impaired. More often, they are unusually creative. Anecdotally, it is said that some talented actors have DID. One professional writer with DID confided that authors who remembered more details of her dissociated childhood abuse did some of her writing. Keeping the complexity of normative self-states in mind helps me enormously in my clinical work with neurotic patients, as well as in my work with DID, where alters influence the patient covertly. However, there is relatively greater mutual awareness and cooperation among self-states than there usually is among the alters of patients with DID, who typically have episodes of amnesia when various alters are out and in control of their behavior. A core goal of their treatment is to work toward greater mutual awareness and internal cooperation. And one goal of theater is to broaden our awareness and empathy for a wide range of characters and for their inner conflicts. I have repeatedly misunderstood DID patients by remaining on the surface of their words. Paradigmatically, this occurs when a patient tells me, "No, I was never abused as a child." That may be factually true for most patients, but if a person has survived severe and sadistic abuse by their relatives and others whom they trust, the statement may actually mean, "No, I was never abused." When alters speak to me directly, which they often do in intensive treatment, one or another of them will sometimes add, "But I was." That is, that it is typical that dissociative parts of the personality form during childhood abuse in an effort to protect the rest of the developing mind from knowing about the trauma. Since close listening and therapeutic work is similar to close reading and literary studies, we discipline ourselves to be alert to the many meanings of the patient's words and of the text, and thus to look for multiple layers of meaning. Alters often speak voluntarily when they realize a therapist is prepared to listen. In doing a 90-minute evaluation of a patient whose colleague asked me if she had DID, I noticed her jerk one arm in an odd way some 45 minutes into the session. She then looked me in the eyes in a confrontational way. I simply said, "Hello." She replied, "How did you know it was me?" That is, this alter was surprised that I noticed the switch. What does all of this have to do with Shakespeare? Everything, or at least a great deal. Hamlet seems to contradict himself when he tells Ophelia, "I loved you once," but then soon adds, "I loved you not." Shakespeare may hope that our unconscious mind will hear this second line as, "I loved you not." So when Hamlet tells Ophelia, "Get thee to a nunnery," his loving self-state may mean a convent, while the hostile self-state who is enraged that she is a suborned informer for her father may use the same words to mean a brothel. Earlier in the scene, when she tries to return his mementos, he could similarly reply, "I never gave you aught." In the final act, Hamlet offers us one model for explaining these contradictions and telling Laertes when he's, quote, "not himself, it is due to his madness. And when he's not himself does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. Who does it then? His madness." I've got to take a sip of water. This is nerve-wracking trying to act Hamlet. You know, it's like the pinnacle of every actor's career. I'm not an actor. The sonnets offer many further such examples. The age-old crux as to whether Hamlet's madness is genuine or feigned is the epitome of Shakespeare's mastery of psychological complexity. At some point in treatment, patients with actual DID frequently tell their therapist, "I've been faking it all along and you fell for it." I favor the theory that Hamlet is not always in full conscious control of his madness. Further, I have often noticed that when a DID patient is being covertly influenced by an alter of which they are unaware, the latter, that is, that alter, is skillful in noticing a suitable feeling or impulse in the patient, then covertly intensifying it, amplifying it for that alter's own ends. The result is that the patient genuinely believes about the resulting behavior, "I meant to do that." I do not suggest that Hamlet suffered from DID, but all of us may at times be influenced more than we realize by one or more unconscious self-state, especially a playwright, I might add. It is too disconcerting to recognize that we sometimes lack conscious control over our actions, and the best playwrights and actors know the dramatic value of dialing up whatever emotional states and conflicts they wish to depict in order to connect with the audience's head and heart. As always, Shakespeare paved the way for psychoanalysts to understand more deeply the complexity of the unconscious mind as it influences our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Hamlet's encounter with Ophelia here follows immediately after his soliloquy about the allure of suicide. Ophelia is one of the several characters Hamlet feels betrayed by, who dies by the play's end. We might even wonder whether Hamlet unconsciously projectively identifies his suicidal impulses into Ophelia, who goes on to enact them. As you know, unlike projection, projective identification is the unconscious defense of ridding ourselves of unwanted feelings by inducing them in someone else. To some extent, this may be one reason that dramatists write plays, to pass their own intolerable feelings onto their audience. Hamlet constantly complicates our understanding of his words. He even challenges our assumptions about theater as an as-if encounter with the world of the imagination, implying that we too may be in reality, quote, guilty creatures sitting at a play. Our patient's first words in an analytic session are always worth taking seriously, since they may announce unconscious themes for what follows. Among Hamlet's first words are those to his mother. "Seems, madam. Nay, it is, I know not seems." He adds that his mourning garments, his sighs, and his tears indeed seem, for they are actions that a man might play. But I have that within which passeth show, these but the trappings and suits of woe. In some ways, then, we are invited to take Hamlet more seriously as an actual person, not just an actor. As Graham Bradshaw observed, quote, Hamlet can seem to be an actual person who somehow has been caught inside a play, and a person who is forced to censor his words to avoid threatening King Claudius. Instead, he turns to, quote, ambiguous giving out. Deprived of the cathartic benefit of speaking out means his suffering will keep intensifying, quote, but break my heart, for I must hold my tongue. Hamlet even genders the very act of speaking freely. I must, like a whore, unpack my heart with words. Any patient's transference is complex, attributing aspects of his parents and siblings to the analyst, as well as unwanted aspects of his own impulses and defenses. Freud probably borrowed from Shakespeare his advice that psychoanalysts should be relatively anonymous, serving more as a mirror to help patients see themselves more objectively. Shakespeare understood that we often deal with unwelcome aspects of our own psychology by projecting them onto others while trying to deny them in ourselves. Hence his message that the mousetrap play within a play and all of Shakespeare's plays are holding a mirror up to us, the audience, so we can know ourselves more deeply as we learn to be more tolerant of others. Shakespeare mirrors this mirror imagery when Hamlet tells Gertrude, you go not till I set you up a glass or a mirror, where you may see the inmost part of you. Seized with feelings of guilt at that point, Gertrude's audible terror about this prospect makes the hidden Polonius afraid Hamlet intends to kill her, leading to his own death. Likewise, Hamlet tells Horatio that he sees in Laertes a reflection of his own conflicts about taking revenge on his father's killer. But I am very sorry, good Horatio, that to Laertes I forgot myself, for by the image of my cause I see the portraiture of his. Seeing oneself reflected in the mirror of an unappealing character potentially helps counteract our tendency to project our least tolerable traits onto another person or group. The mirror Shakespeare holds up to human nature also encourages us to be less judgmental. Shakespeare knew that being judgmental limits our capacity for empathy and understanding, a lesson every psychoanalyst must take to heart to do effective clinical work. Bessel van der Kolk told me in his 50s that he had just begun reading Shakespeare and was dazzled by Shakespeare's profound understanding of every character without ever being judgmental. And I can't resist telling you that Bessel told me a year ago that he became an Oxfordian after hearing one or two of my talks. Yet another dimension of Hamlet's complexity lies in its many religious allusions, both direct and intertextual. Shakespeare is full of intertextuality, not only with the Bible, but also with works of theology. Atheist and agnostic Shakespeare scholars sometimes ignore the religious allusions, that's a good pun, in Shakespeare, since they project onto Shakespeare their own lack of personal interest in religion. Psychoanalysts are trained to put aside our personal feelings as much as we can in listening to our patients' feelings about religion, politics, or anything. There are misleading efforts to oversimplify Shakespeare as Protestant or Catholic, which is another false binary. However, Shakespeare may have intended to leave unsettled the crux of whether purgatory exists, so that the ghost of King Hamlet might actually be his soul speaking to Prince Hamlet, rather than the devil, or might instead be a symptom of madness. Hamlet's famous final words are, "The rest is silence," echoing his words in the second scene of the play, "But break my heart, for I must hold my tongue." We might ponder the possible allusion to an early modern proverb, itself based on an ancient one, quote, "The ornament of a woman is silence." I hear some of you saying, "You can't say that." I'm sorry, I just did. Sorry, I apologize. I think I'm getting tired. There is a faint hint that Hamlet's struggle with suicidal impulses is influenced by his equating life with his masculine identity and death with his surrendering to his feminine self-states. Recall that earlier in this final scene, Hamlet repudiates his misgivings about having agreed to fence with Laertes by saying such doubts are merely those, quote, "as would trouble a woman." Thus, he bolsters his resolve to fight Laertes by spurning fears he regards as shamefully feminine. Now, what is the right age to introduce young people to Shakespeare? Traditionally, Jewish men had to wait until they were 40 to be allowed to study the mystical Kabbalah, for fear its complexity might otherwise be psychologically dangerous. Shakespeare, on the contrary, uses complexity in a way that meets profound needs in people of all ages. Likewise, every adult has self-states that were formed at different ages, and Shakespeare, possibly uniquely, seems to address all of them. The underlying narratives of Shakespeare's late romances have been compared with fairy tales, but these are not the only plays that can appeal to children. For example, as I was writing this chapter, I showed a 20-minute children's version of Hamlet to our 7-year-old granddaughter. The play was new to her. From the beginning, she was deeply absorbed in the story and full of questions that got to the heart of the matter, sometimes in ways that were revelations to me. I began to suspect that the play was stirring up intense feelings in her when she asked me to pause the film repeatedly to slow the pace in order to process her emotional reactions and talk about them with me. For example, she wondered if Gertrude knew Claudius had murdered King Hamlet. She added, "I think she did because she looked happy in the opening scene, sitting with King Claudius." She asked about the ghost of King Hamlet. "Is he real?" I explained the different possibilities that Hamlet himself considered. She asked how Ophelia died. After I told her Ophelia drowned, she said, "Maybe she wanted to go be with her father." She compared the plot with that of her favorite film, The Lion King. She reminded me that Scar, one of Disney's greatest villains, killed his brother Mufasa to take the throne. She added, "Scar did that because he had been bitten by a venomous snake." She did not know, of course, that Scar was actually based on King Claudius and Hamlet. The end of the play seemed especially difficult for her to bear. Just as Gertrude was about to drink from the poisoned chalice, she asked me if Gertrude knew it was poison. She asked ahead of time which characters would die, and she seemed overwhelmed that nearly, quote, "everybody died." Hamlet asked Horatio to, quote, "tell my story." I explained to our granddaughter that Shakespeare may have hoped this play would tell his own story with enough disguise that it would escape censorship and come down to future centuries. I told her I loved reading inspiring biographies as a boy. Once I got interested in Shakespeare when I was about 12, I was eager to learn more about him. I was crushed when I read back then in the introduction to my complete works of Shakespeare that, quote, "one of the greatest mysteries of English drama is the fact that so very little is known about the life of William Shakespeare." It was 40 years before I learned the real Shakespeare was the Earl of Oxford, and we have a wealth of relevant biographical facts about him. Concluding remarks. So far, I have emphasized the maladaptive aspects of groupthink, but there are other relevant aspects of group psychology. A psychoanalytic perspective can illuminate the regressive experience of the group of spectators as together we watch a Shakespeare play. We may loosen our ego boundaries and become more suggestible as we identify with the group and their attitude toward a leader, in this case, the playwright and his imaginary creation. Shakespeare understood, as well as any playwright ever has, that theater offers the audience such an adaptively regressive experience, with a dark theater inducing a sleep-like state of mind, making us more receptive to our unconscious self states and to both conscious and unconscious channels of communication from the playwright through the actors. Likewise, Shakespeare understood enough about group psychology to grasp that the effective use of rhetoric can profoundly stir a crowd's emotions, whether in the theater itself or in the dramatized ancient Roman audiences listening to Mark Antony's speech in Julius Caesar. We may wish to compartmentalize our theatrical encounter within the world of the imagination and not let it spill over too much into the real world of our everyday lives. Freud cited Gustave Le Bon's contention that group dynamics may generate a hypnotic state in its members, so that the group, quote, is led almost exclusively by the unconscious. Shakespeare's very complexity can also contribute to such a hypnotic-like state, just as some hypnotic induction techniques do deliberately. One thinks of Hamlet alluding to thoughts beyond the reaches of our souls. Pondering those words may lure us beyond the reaches of our normal consciousness. In summary, I've used the perspective of clinical psychoanalysis to explore several facets of the infinite variety of Shakespeare's full complexity. Psychoanalytically informed biographical readings of Shakespeare need not be abandoned if we follow John Keats' advice about tolerating uncertainties and reconsider who the real author was. I hope my chapter will help restore the ongoing relevance of psychoanalytic approaches to Shakespeare and will lead to a fresh look at Oxfordian authorship theory. For those of you still awake, thank you. For those of you who are asleep, I understand perfectly. Now, I realize some of you may have comments and questions you're eager to pose at this point. However, I am too exhausted at the moment to think straight, so I'll ask you to hold them or post them in the Q&A. I'm grateful that my friend and colleague Sam Goldberg has agreed to be our discussant. Sam is a training and supervising analyst in the Washington Baltimore Institute. He is co-author with the late William Goldstein of the book, Using the Transference in Psychotherapy. He has spoken on the tragedies of Shakespeare at the Folger Shakespeare Theater and elsewhere. In recent years, he has published essays on Macbeth and Hamlet and the American Psychoanalyst. And last year, he organized and presented at a weekend conference at New Directions on Shakespeare and the Nature of Tragedy. Most recently, he has a book review in the current issue of JAPA. Sam, can you spotlight yourself? Or if not, I will, and you're unmuted. So take away, Sam. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know how to spotlight myself, but
I think I can do it.
Well, thank you, Rick.
Sure.
It's a great honor to have been asked to discuss this paper of my good friend, Rick Waugaman, on Shakespeare and psychological complexity. Rick is a force of nature, having nearly encyclopedic knowledge of all things psychoanalytic and all things Shakespearean. Rick always manifests an attitude of humanity and good humor, which I suspect both has drawn him to and continues to be nourished by his deep love of the bard. We study Shakespeare not only for the perfection of his works and the beauty of his language, but most of all for his transcendent wisdom regarding human matters, people's actions, joys, and sufferings, their social and political lives, and their psychology. We study Shakespeare to become better people ourselves. Rick's paper overflows with insights. Choosing only a few points on which to focus, I'm going to speed through first how a dramatist conveys her own psychological complexity to her characters, and turning to how that depiction activates psychological complexity in the reader, I will mention three perspectives: neurophysiologic, the structural and object relation theories of psychoanalysis, and then finally the implications that Rick touches upon in his discussion of Hamlet. For centuries, there's been no doubt about the supreme genius of Shakespeare. William Hazlitt, who lived from 1778 to 1830, wrote, quote, "He is not so much an imitator as an instrument of nature, and it is not so much that he speaks from her as that she speaks through him. His characters are of nature herself," end of quotes. So this introduces our first question. Is it valid to take literary characters as truly natural, that is, real, and in some sense living? Some modern critics, and Rick referred to this in his paper, deny the validity of regarding literary characters as being truly like real human beings. As B.F. Sokol wrote, quote, many no longer believe in minds or in characters. Where am I? As something other than author positions or cultural constructs. In their view, words on the page have no life of their, that's the end of the quote. In their view, words on the page have no life of their own, and characters are mere linguistic phenomena, extended metaphors, symbolic actions, or aesthetic contraptions. Those critics, or people who think that way, do not see words and ideas as seeds planted in the psyche. They may take root and ramify and establish a life of their own as genuine experience, narratives, and convictions that animate and develop a living human mind. Nobody would bother to read a novel, however, or go to the theater if they thought throughout that what they were reading or observing was mere contrivance. The naive, non-critical reader or moviegoer suspends disbelief and willingly submits to the artist's enchantment. Spurning the mediation of abstract concepts, he experiences the character's situation, actions, and suffering immediately, as if they were really happening here and now. I think that's all of our experience in watching a movie. In fact, we cannot avoid responding to well-presented characters emotionally, even if subliminally so. Ellis Frattaroli writes, quote, we have no choice. We inevitably experience characters on stage or on paper as people. If we wish to describe our immediate experience, we cannot avoid talking about characters as if they were people. End of quote. The whole purpose of literary portrayal of characters is to affect the reader personally. He will identify with the character in his predicament and have genuine emotions. How then do we account for this universal and inescapable reaction of readers to literature? How does a fictional character such as Ahab, Lear, or Hamlet so capture our imagination as to appear indeed a living reality, often more so than people we actually know? Let's consider for a moment, not the written, but the theatrical presentation of a drama. By the way, I'm going to speak of the observer of a drama and the reader of a book interchangeably, pretty much. When observing an actor on the stage, we spontaneously make inferences about the character's experience and intentions from his mere gestures, vocal tones, and facial expressions. How this works is rooted in our very neurophysiology. Via systems such as mirror neuron networks, our perception of characters' feelings, intentions, and actions lead us also to experience and identify with what they are shown as experiencing and doing. All of this involves spontaneous hormonal and physiological responses, including promptings toward motor actions, imitating or reacting to the actions portrayed. For example, brain imaging studies have shown that observing emotional states in others, such as pain, disgust, or fear, automatically activates parts of the same neural networks in the observer that would process pain, disgust, or fear, were the observer himself to experience them. In other words, he is implicitly experiencing them, but in a less intense way, somewhat subliminally. Likewise, directly observing someone else's actions automatically activates in the observer same neurological networks that would be active were he or she to carry out that action herself. Watching somebody lift his hand as if to strike a blow activates in the observer the very same brain apparatus that would lift a hand to strike a blow, even if the observer does not actually carry out the action. There is evidence that corresponding networks are activated in the observer even when he indirectly hears or reads about, or merely imagines or speaks the word of a given action. We can thus conceive how the vision of the character on the stage or on the page when we read Shakespeare evoke in the observer or reader what is in effect empathic identification with the character. Feelings, meanings, conflicts, and actions of the character are recreated, vivified, you might say, in the imaginative mind of the reader. It does not seem a stretch, therefore, to say that in the mind of the reader or the observer, the character has become literally alive. But we're here not merely to focus on the neurophysiology of empathy. Let's turn to psychoanalytic conceptualizations. Again, how do we explain the fact that most people spontaneously experience fictional characters as real? I'm just going to be very brief about the structural theory. In the structural theory, all experiences, acts, and creations of a human mind necessarily are multi-determined, drawing from the entire range of simultaneously active mental functions, all to varying degrees expressed, disguised, and integrated into a compromise. An author then will inevitably manifest in her characters aspects of her own inner conflicts. This is not much different from saying that she projects aspects of herself, perhaps, for example, both moralistic strictness and rebellious sexuality, into the character, and thus projects them also into the audience member or reader, as we just described, who identifies with that character. Rick referred to Philip Bromberg. Bromberg suggested that consciousness and the psyche are essentially non-unitary in origin. Like Otto Kernberg, he posited multiple discrete, affect-charged, self-other configurations, which he called self-states. These can be conceptualized as the building blocks of psychic structure. In other words, I'm kind of suggesting that the structural theory and this object relation self-state theory are not mutually incompatible, kind of like how light can be described as waves or as particles, two different ways of conceptualizing, but they're looking at the same thing. That's how I see this different ways of conceptualizing human experience. A defensive attitude, for example, a superego structure, can be called one self-state. What's warded off, which could be called an id structure, is another self-state. Ideally, distinct self-states might be integrated into a more or less continuous, overarching sense of being a cohesive self, with all of the self-states simultaneously accessible to the observing ego. This is Bromberg that I'm paraphrasing. The level of integration, however, varies from individual to individual. This is back to being me, who I'm paraphrasing, and also within a given individual over time, for example, as responsive to specific environmental or interpersonal stresses. Rick told us that creative people might have, I'm quoting him, quote, more permeable boundaries among their various self-states.
Okay, I want to get rid of
Did you get the new link?
Please mute yourselves.
Probably too late. I have no idea what they're talking about
He's
now.
reading and
All right, well, I'll keep listening, but it's only like another half.
you're muted, Sam.
I muted everybody, but I couldn't unmute you. So
Okay.
please unmute yourself. Thank you,
Can you
Sam.
hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Rick told us that creative people might have, quote, more permeable boundaries among their various self-states, and that optimal mental health and especially artistic creativity, as in writing a work of literature, seem to be promoted by greater mutual awareness and cooperation among self-states, end of quoting Rick. Consider how a playwright, in effect, explodes her multifaceted self onto the page, externalizing there, in dialogue and interaction among her characters, the relations of her self-states, in effect expressing the plot of an inner dream. By analogy, we all in a similar process in our real lives enact some unconscious agenda, a storyline composed out of the configuration of our self-states. The activity of creative writing might be seen as a form of self-analysis, by which the author can observe the component structures of his or her personality separately interacting and negotiating with one another. It is as if she is merely the stage for an independently running play within herself, and she merely reports what she observes. The story, like a dream, writes itself. This creation may express aspects of herself of which she may have been only dimly aware. Yet in the moment, it emerges fully formed like Aphrodite from the head of Zeus. The gestation has occurred unconsciously, and the author at the time of delivery may feel rhapsodically transported by something other than, if not greater and wiser than herself. Likewise, therefore, for the reader of the drama, to use Rick's phrase, we can say that Shakespeare promotes, quote, the mutual awareness and cooperation among self-states, end of quote, as we identify with each of the characters, each being in effect a singular self-state, presumably of the author, and now through identification of our own. To illustrate all of this, Rick turns to Hamlet, who has been disillusioned in love both by his mother, who hastily married the uncle Hamlet suspects may have killed his father, and also disillusioned by Ophelia, who followed her brother's and father's injunctions to reject him. Hamlet responds with apparent madness. And Rick asks, is he merely feigning, or is he at times truly out of control? Hamlet indeed acts impetuously, often contradicting himself. He loves Ophelia, but he tells her that he loves her not. He denies that he gave her the memento she tries to return. Rick says this can be seen as switching between dissociated self-states. Moreover, he suggests Hamlet may rid himself of his admitted suicidal wishes or feelings by inducing them in Ophelia. Certainly, Hamlet's emotionally brutal treatment of her and his killing her father have stressed Ophelia beyond endurance, even to the point of undoubted psychosis. We might say that via projective identification, she takes on feelings he's forcefully projected onto her, and she does become suicidal and completes the act. All this pent-up drama bursts forward when Hamlet fights with Ophelia's brother Laertes at her gravesite. Rick usefully quotes Hamlet's later apology to Laertes before their fatal duel. Hamlet admits, quote, "What I have done was madness. Was it Hamlet who wronged Laertes? Never Hamlet. If Hamlet, when he's not himself, does wrong Laertes, then Hamlet does it not. Hamlet denies it. Who does it then? His madness." End of quoting Hamlet. This echoes the words of St. Paul in Romans chapter 7, lines 14 through 17, where Paul writes, quote, "For what I hate, that I do. If then I do that which I would not, it is no more I that do it, but sin that dwelleth within me." End of quote. We can thus describe Hamlet's madness, his frailty, disillusionment, anguish, confusion, and impulsiveness, 4 ways. In theological terms, as deriving from the inescapable sin intrinsic to what St. Paul called our body of death. In neurological terms, of competing brain circuits inhibited or overwhelmed by the excessive activation of other circuits. Or in psychoanalytic terms, of structural conflicts or competing dissociated self-states. All are grasping the same psychological reality. Rick's statement that dramatists may write plays, quote, "to pass their own intolerable feelings onto the audience," end of quote, may certainly be true. It's not necessary, though, that the dramatist necessarily project such feelings into the character and audience merely to rid himself of them. as opposed to patients, by whom I mean all of us. The dramatist does not necessarily project merely for the purpose of defense. He may do so out of an exuberance of confidence, an abundance of life, and a will to share with and move others, all as a way of healing himself and healing the world. And I believe this was certainly Shakespeare's spirit and goal. Rick writes, quote, "Seeing oneself reflected in the mirror of an unappealing character potentially helps counter our tendency to project our least tolerable traits onto another person or group." End of quotes. That is, one can acknowledge the sin within me, in Paul's words, by which he learns humility, to see the beam in his own eye before pointing to the splinter in someone else's. I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. And to be more empathic and less judgmental toward others generally. Rick explores the implications of Horatio repeating a phrase of John Calvin when Horatio says that he'll truly deliver, how the feast of corpses got laid out for proud death. Shakespeare here seems to be referring to the Eucharist and Holy Communion, in which bread and wine are consecrated and consumed as Christ's body and blood. Rick doesn't make explicit his clear implication that Hamlet may be seen as a Christ figure, whose devoted relation to his father required tormenting passion and death. I believe Shakespeare clearly intended the comparison, but I'd argue he also intended a great irony there. For Hamlet's father was hardly godlike, but one confined to fast and fires until his sins could be burned off and purged. Shakespeare thus may be offering a commentary on our unquestioning devotion to filial duty and our willingness to self-sacrifice in causes we don't understand. We, like Hamlet, are inevitably to some degree blind to our true motives, confused as to what we're actually doing, and undiscerning of what will be the ultimate consequences. Like characters in or the audience of Hamlet, the play, we too may cause or, quote, hear of carnal, bloody, and unnatural acts, of accidental judgments, casual slaughters, and purposes mistook, fallen on the inventors' heads, end of quote. That is, in Hamlet as elsewhere, Shakespeare shows that our psychological complexity comes at a near infinite, with our psychological complexity comes a nearly infinite capacity for self-deception. On the other hand, the bard also shows that the act of writing and sharing human stories, paired with the audience's act of viewing, reading, and resonating with them, ideally may allow a mutual working through of human dilemmas and suffering impossible for anyone in isolation. The activity and experience of dramatist, actors, and audience thus may enact not merely a fictional presentation, but a mutually shared act of communion, reconciling with the fathomless meaning of life. Thank you.